Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our first Agape Latte Speaker of the Year, Dr. Courtney Bryant. I had the amazing opportunity of having her in class this past spring and can honestly say that it was one of the classes that I've learned the most from and look forward to every single week. Dr. Bryant is an assistant professor in the Religious Studies Department, where she has taught courses such as The Nature and Experience of Religion, Religion in the Body, and Black Women, Justice, and God. Her work focuses on the racial, gender, and sexual politics of embodiment. In addition to being a wonderful professor, Dr. Bryant is also an ordained minister. If you haven't yet gotten the chance to take one of Dr. Bryant's classes, I highly recommend doing so, as she's a really excellent professor. We're so excited for her talk entitled Expanding Our We, The Importance of Difference Across Relationship.
I definitely explore intersections of the body, identity politics, as well as explore the theological significance of the erotic, the theological significance of the erotic. And when people hear that, they automatically think that I am always sitting in my office reading about sex. But the way that I define the erotic, or the way that womanist discourse defines the erotic, is the manifestation of love in and through the flesh. Okay? The manifestation of love in and through the flesh. And we understand it in that way because we believe that love comes from God. And because love comes from God, womanists, which are Black women, I should probably also mention that, womanism is a school of thought that is born out of the feminist tradition and born out of the Black theological tradition. So just very quickly, I am a theological ethicist, a womanist theological ethicist. And what that means is that I take into consideration the real lives of Black women and put them at the center of my academic investigation. And so much of my time is spent looking at the ways that Black women use their bodies to communicate love and to express their freedom. And this is a tall order because, as we know, Black women often fall on the lower end of the totem pole in terms of the social hierarchy. We know that Black women, or as Malcolm X once said, are the most abused and disrespected people in America. Now, I think that as time has gone on, we can certainly debate about who is on the lower end of the totem pole at this point in time. And I definitely think that Black women share that space with a number of people who have identities that are considered outside of the norm. But the womanist tradition explores how things impact Black women, how ideas are shaped out of the experiences of Black women and the perspectives of Black women. And it's really interesting because I never imagined that I was going to be a professor. When I was growing up, when I was 7 years old, I was very smart. And everyone used to always tell me, oh, you're so smart, blah, blah, blah. And my mom would always say, you know, whenever you get in trouble, it's almost as if you're a Philadelphia lawyer. You come with your briefcase and you're going to explain why you did it, what was going on, and why you need to be pardoned. And so that really took root in me. And I really thought that I was going to be a lawyer. I thought this the entire time that I was in high school and applying to colleges. And then once I got to college, I got to this course in the law and I loved it, but I didn't know if it was for me. And I remember making a call to my parents like, I don't know if I want to be a lawyer, like it's cool and stuff, but I just feel like there's more for me. There's something that I'm not tapping into that I want to tap into. And this was at like maybe 20 years old. I graduated from college with a major in English. And, you know, I bounced around from job to job, not quite sure what I was trying to do. But in the midst of it, there were already these core principles that had been established in me. Primarily, there was the core principle of love. I came from a family that was very, very big on hospitality, meaning that we took whoever in, made them feel loved, made sure that they had what they needed. And this was just kind of a way of life for us. This way of life was definitely born out of our faith. I I come from a family that is religious, right? We are Christian people, but not just culturally Christian, right? You know how sometimes there are folks who are Christians, but they're Christians because their mom and dad are Christian or because their families are Christian, but that they don't necessarily have a sense of relationship with God. I was not like that. We sang the doxology every Sunday night instead of saying grace. And the doxology is that song. Remember, praise God from whom all blessings flow. Like we would literally sing that every Sunday night. The term or the phrase, "What would Jesus do?" resounded in my ears constantly because my mother was a good Baptist lady who loves to pray, loves to read the Bible, and loves to interpret the things of the world through a theological lens or through like a lens of the spirit. I remember very often seeing my mother pray, and I don't mean just like praying in a chair, but literally on her knees praying before God. And I just realized that this spiritual thing was serious, right? This wasn't just something that we said, but this was something that we were. This is a certain kind of way that we walked and we talked and the way that we treated people. It was beautiful being a part of my family, actually. So beautiful that, I carried this love and this hospitality with me wherever I went. Well, the places that I went demonstrated to me that this ethic of hospitality was not necessarily something that was common. Not at all. In fact, life and different institutions hurt my feelings over and over and over again as I expected this warmth and this hospitality and this sense of community in spaces that were foreign to me, right? I remember being in high school and, well, actually even before that, I remember going to church with my parents as we were growing up. And the church that I grew up in was a congregational church, right? And a congregational church is a little different than a Catholic church or a Methodist church. It's a different denomination, and the denomination is part of the Anabaptist tradition, if that makes sense to anyone, or if anyone is familiar with those terms. But essentially, we were Protestants. And the church that we went to was very diverse, very diverse. So growing up, I didn't know color lines. They didn't make sense to me. There were white people who came to my house for dinner all the time. There were Latino people who came to my house to my house all the time. There were Asian people who came to my house all the time. And part of the reason why is because I grew up in New York, right? And so growing up in New York, you have this conglomerate of all of these different kinds of people. And all of these different kinds of people, for some particular reason, were worshiping in this congregational space. So for me, both home was a space of hospitality, but church was also a space of hospitality. And not only hospitality, but racial hospitality in such a way that I didn't realize that there were these strong barriers, right? These strong social barriers that said that I wasn't supposed to play with white children or Latino children weren't supposed to play with Asian children. We were all just sort of together, singing songs, making food, going to dances, putting on pageants. And this was just a way of life. It wasn't until I got to high school, and because of my intellectual gifts, my mom wanted to make sure that I got the best education possible. So I went to a private school, specifically Rye Country Day. Anybody ever heard of it? Dr. Lee is like, ooh, yes. And so Rye Country Day was this incredibly elite space, right? It's the place where celebrities and very rich people in New York sent their kids to go to high school. It was actually, it started in pre-K and went all the way to 12th grade. I got there actually in 8th grade. And when I got there, I didn't feel hospitality. I didn't feel a sense of love. What I felt was a dramatic sense of difference, right? Very, very different, because I was one of 4 Black students in my entire grade. And so I went from a very diverse space to a very homogenous space where I was the other. And I didn't really know how to make sense of it, but I always had this strong sense of love, this strong sense of pride. And so I drew people to me as a result. One might say that I was a very charismatic teen. And so I was able, because of my diverse background, because of my confidence, to excel pretty much in any community that I was placed in. But while I was able to excel as I moved in and out of the various spaces that I had to be in, whether it was church, which was all Black, I'm sorry. So we changed churches and we became Baptist when I was 12. And so we'd started going to this all Black Baptist church. So church was all Black now. School was all white. Home was Black, but not black, right? And I say that because it matters, because as I was moving about, the cadence of my voice, the way that my diction, my English, it didn't represent what people typically understood as Black. Oh, you're so educated. Well, oh, you're so eloquent. Where do you go? Oh, you're different, Courtney, right? All of that. So what I found was that people had a lot of difficulty understanding who I was. Interestingly enough, I knew who I was, right? And was very comfortable in that skin, but I was always fascinated by the kinds of assumptions that were placed upon me and the kinds of expectations that followed me. So that when I performed in particular ways, people were always shocked and taken aback. Because of the opportunities that had been afforded to me through education. As I continued through my education, I continued also to have this sense of call in my life. At first, I didn't understand it. I remember being in college and wanting to do what folks do in college. You guys know. But I was also attending a church service. Now, this is the hilarious part. I was attending a church service that met for college students. Guess what time they met? 7:30 on Sunday night. Because they knew that the college students would be out partying. And indeed, we were. But I would always make sure that regardless of the fact that I was partying, I always wanted to make sure that I presented myself to the Lord, or at least that's the way that, I thought about it. And this church was really good because they had a way of making things incredibly relevant. But also teaching us about various theological doctrines in the Christian church. And so as I continued to grow, I also continued to become more and more aware of my gifts, particularly my gifts for speaking, my gifts for teaching. And so after getting out of college, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, right? I was supposed to be this lawyer. I'd made this sort of about face. And then I found myself graduating from college and not knowing what I could do. I worked a couple of jobs in the nonprofit world. And then one day, my mother, who I also call my agent, told me that she had met a patient who had this great job at the United States Tennis Association, and she had talked me up, and I was now going to have a job. The most money I'd ever made in my life. It was a big girl job, right? I was in my 20s, I think, and this job was had me traveling all over the place and talking about diversity. Now, this was interesting because diversity had always been important to me because of my experiences in education. But it was also important to me because I didn't just want there to be a representation of Black people or Asian people and Hispanic people, but I knew that diversity wouldn't matter unless there was equity, right? And so as I think about it, the thread throughout all of my life is my parents' love and hospitality at home, this tremendous sense of community, but then also this thirst for diversity, equity, and justice. The sense of justice grew in me because as I traveled by train from Rye, the school that I went to, back home to Mount Vernon. I don't know if many of you are familiar with Mount Vernon, but there's a big difference between Rye and Mount Vernon. And you can see that difference as you travel on the train. And while I was blessed enough to have both a mother and a father and a loving, hospitable household, there were a lot of my friends who didn't. There were also a lot of my friends who didn't have the same kind of financial resources as the people I saw in Rye. Heck, I didn't have the kind of financial resources that we saw at Rye. And so while my friends were like, oh yeah, why don't you come over to my house and, we can ride horses this weekend? I'd be like, you can come over to my house and sit in my garage. And so I began to see the stark differences, right? in terms of class, in terms of communities of color, as opposed to white communities. And this is not to say that every white community is an elite community, because we certainly know that that's not the case. But these stark differences were constantly being presented to me, so that I was analyzing them at a very young age and coming to some very real conclusions, and gaining a certain level of insight and wisdom. Excuse me. So after I got out of college, my relationship with God started to change. I started to take it more seriously. I started to see the ways in which I needed to be responsible for my relationship with God. And a lot of people would say that I was going through that process of transitioning from Jesus as my Savior to Jesus as my Lord. Right? In the Christian community, there are a lot of people who tend to say, oh yeah, Jesus died for me and that's what it is. And we revel in that. We love it. But we don't take into consideration this notion of Jesus as Lord, right? This notion that we need to submit to God, right? And that we are reflections of God, and that we collaborate with God in creating goodness in the world. But I took this really seriously. And it's funny. I think it was the first time I ever got my heart broken. Anybody ever had that? A heartbreak? I was super, I was kind of a jerk, right? And I was a jerk because I was so smart. And so I felt like I knew everything. And because I felt like I knew everything, there was a lack of humility about me that followed everything that I did. But get your heart broken once, and you will quickly find that you become very humble, right? But God used that sense of humility in that moment and in that experience to draw me closer to the Spirit. And I'm forever grateful for that. When I returned back home and I was working for the USTA, I was doing a lot of speaking, like so much speaking. And every time I got up to speak, I kept wanting to talk about Jesus. This is not good in corporate America, right? They want to hear, about how diversity makes sense. And I want to talk about it from a more moral and ethical perspective. Well, one day I remember saying something. It was something spiritual in my office. I didn't even know that my boss had heard me, but she did. And she came in and she reprimanded me and told me that I needed to keep my religion outside of the office. It was in that evening that I realized that I would be going to seminary. I was sitting in prayer, just kind of talking to God, like, what's going on? Like, yeah, I'm making great money and this is wonderful, but again, that lack of fulfillment, that desire to be doing something else. And for me, it wasn't just so much about talking about God, although that was super important, but it was also about helping people and equipping people to walk in a way that is worthy of that moniker of Christian, or that label of, in relationship with God. And so between the racial and class disparities that I'd experienced, my love of God, getting a good swift kick in the butt so that I would become more humble, I began to realize that this notion of love and community, justice and equity was this thread that it was in fact my purpose. It was in fact my purpose. I realized that I had a great gift for breaking down difficult concepts and helping people understand them, but more than that, that they felt a sense of connection, that they felt like they were drawn in to these lessons. And so I remember one day praying to God, God, and it was such a simple prayer. God, I'm just so thankful for my life. I'm thankful for my gifts. And I just want to give everything that I have to you, every gift that I have, every talent that I have. I just offer them to you, right? And so I said this prayer, and it was really simple. And then I went to bed. And in the middle of the night, I kid you not, there was this rush that came upon my body. It was an embodied experience where I had no choice, but my body literally lifted up out of the bed and threw itself almost down in a prostrate position. So now I'm praying like this. And there's the best thing I could do is call it a kind of visitation, right? I'm not really sure to this day. I do not have words to describe it. But what I didn't know in that time was that God was getting me ready and was going to use me in a way that I was unsure of and unclear of. I applied for divinity school, or seminary, as many of you might call it, and got into all of the schools that I applied to, and I was shocked. But I was like, how are we going to pay for this, God? What are we going to do? Well, I'll tell you what, I'll go. I'll quit my job for you, but you've got to pay for it. And so a couple of months later, the scholarship started rolling in. It was crazy. It made no sense. But I ultimately chose Duke University as a place where I would do my seminary career. And I went there specifically because of its Office of Reconciliation. They had this very great program where they reflected theologically on reconciliation. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that they took into consideration the brother of what is his name? What is his name? The brother, Anita, what's his name that comes back? Thank you. The brother of the prodigal son. Sorry, it's 7:30. No, it's 8. My brain really doesn't work anymore. So yeah. So has anybody ever heard the story of the prodigal son? Is everybody familiar? But for those who are unfamiliar, the prodigal son is a story that is found in the New Testament. And essentially, he takes his inheritance or demands his inheritance from his father, goes out and squanders it, and finds himself lying among the pigs. This is a Jewish story, so you can only imagine what it means to be lying among pigs as a Jewish person. Anyway, he finds himself lying among the pigs, and he comes back to his father and asks for forgiveness. And his father is so excited to see him back that he brings the best robe and brings a ring and, just celebrates his son and celebrates this repentance. And there's a particular sculpture at Duke where you see this perspective of not the son and not the father, but the brother of the family, the brother who had always done right. Right? The brother who had been with the father, who didn't demand his birthright or his inheritance. And so we were constantly looking at things from different perspectives. I'm trying to fast forward. All right. So I'm good? Okay. Keep me on time. So while I was there, I did this really life-changing internship. The goal was to create opportunities for relationships across racial difference. I was an old hat at this, right? Whether it be my old church, whether it be my high school, whether it be, I'm the diversity woman. This is what I do. I get paid for it, right? And so I applied for the program, got into it, and I guess we can call it the prize or the fellowship was going to Mississippi for a summer to serve in a church, right? And so as a Black person, I was supposed to go and serve in a white church, but there was also another girl who came with me. She was a white seminarian who was scheduled to work in a Black church. So it was sort of this cross-pollination. And we were supposed to live together as well. So we were supposed to continue to get to know one another. So we're living in Mississippi. Need I tell you, this is not somewhere Black people want to be. Black people don't often want to go to Mississippi. It's a little bit scary. We've heard about the lynching. We've heard about the racial violence. So I'm there and I'm feeling a little bit out of sorts, but trying to make my way. And Christina, who was the other student who was there, was living with me. And so over the course of time, Christina and I would eat our meals together. We would work together. We shared a room. We would, we developed a great sense of intimacy. And so in so doing, one day we were at a meeting. Now, I'm going to let you guys in on a little secret. And those people of color, and maybe even the women in the room might understand what I'm talking about. Oftentimes when you're a minority in a situation and you get into a room, what's the first thing that you do? Anybody know? Rabia knows. Yeah, tell me.
Look around and see who else is in the room.
Exactly. You look around, who else is in the room? Where are my allies? Where can I feel safe? And so, over the course of my life, much like many African Americans, I stepped into this room and, this meeting full, well, it wasn't full, it was a diverse room. And I was counting the Black people in the room. And I was like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, there are 6 Black people in this room. There are 6 people with whom I can feel safe with. There are 6 people who can act as resources for me. And then after I stopped for a moment. I was like, wait a second. I had done something really strange. I had counted Christina as part of the group, part of the Black people, part of the safe people. And for the life of me, I was like, how did that happen? And then I began to realize she had somehow transcended racial barriers because of the intimacy that we shared in working together, in living together, in eating together, in talking together, in laughing together, and in crying together. And it made me realize that these categories of race that we so often erect for the sake of preservation, of power, for the sake of influence, for the sake of peer pressure, were not real, in fact. And that just like the people at my church, these were human beings, right? This is a human being who bleeds just like I do, who gets hungry just like I do, who gets scared just like I do. And that there was something about the experience of being together, of living together, of working together, that was able to chip away at those barriers that attempted to separate us. And instead, because of the spirit of collaboration, because of the intimacy we shared, because of our similar faith, right? We were able to see one another almost as kin, right? As brothers and as sisters. And so I began to think about the impact that these sorts of encounters, right? That what happens when we bring our bodies to a situation? What happens when we put our bodies in new situations? And so I continued to reflect on that during my time at Duke. And then I began thinking about what I was going to do next. Was I going to go be a reverend? I knew I never was going to be a reverend. I knew that. Was I going to go create curriculums for churches? Maybe. But there was still something saying, well, there's still more. Yeah, you might want to go for another 5 years of school. Said nobody ever. But still, this is what I was wrestling with, right? I was wrestling with issues of race, trying to figure out how to surmount the obstacles of white supremacy and racism in a social setting. But I was also in love with learning. I was in love with what Thomas Aquinas would call faith-seeking understanding, right? And this notion that I could love God with my mind. This was very different. So as you guys know, I started out in a congregational church, right? Which was pretty high church and, as I said, diverse. But when I moved to the Baptist church, I found this new way of worshiping, this ecstatic way of worshiping, right? With lots of hand clapping and shouting and singing. And this was foreign to me, right? We were not used to this. My mom was part of the chancel choir. We sang opera. And so to be sitting here singing, watching them as they sang gospel was this amazing experience. But it also taught me about the power of the Spirit and how what I did, whether it was using my brain, whether it was playing on the playground, whether it was dating, in all of these things, I was representing God. Right. And so as a result, I took it really, really seriously and wanted to see how I could harness this sense of relationship with God to build a more just world. And so I went to a PhD program, this time Vanderbilt University. And this was an exercise in putting my body in a new place. Duke University was incredibly conservative and what most people might call Orthodox Christianity. It means that, they stick to the Bible. They don't really veer from it. They don't really have a very progressive agenda. And even at that time, they were having a hard time embracing the LGBTQI community. And so after I was done at Duke, right, which was great, I say they do Jesus right, but they also do Jesus white. So It's kind of a catch-22, kind of like the womanist tradition. It's like, well, I'm not quite a white feminist, but I'm also not a black man who's into theology. In the same sense, I was this wonderful, zealous Christian, right? And I wanted the orthodoxy, I wanted the rigor, but I also needed a sense of that progressiveness to give me a better account of theology from a racialized perspective. And I didn't get that. And so I decided to go to Vanderbilt University for my PhD. And this was an exercise in putting my body in a new place. Or as it says in the Bible, Jesus would go to the other side. This was an exercise in going to the other side. Vanderbilt was a much more progressive place. At Vanderbilt, if you go there, you can worship a tree if you so feel. They tend to attract more seekers as opposed to Orthodox Christians. And so it was a new sort of way to experience difference. I wasn't different because I was Black. I wasn't different because I was a woman. I was different because I was more of a conservative Christian than the space was used to. But in all of these experiences of difference, what I found was that the more I made myself uncomfortable, the more I put my body and myself in a new place so that I might experience a new perspective, the more I learned about myself, the more I learned about God, and the more I learned about others. And I began to think through how I might put all of this information together, right? How do I gather this information about the love and hospitality of God while also attending to the differences of our bodies and the ways that our differences cause us to show up differently in the world, but also cause people to receive us differently, right? And so I began writing about the erotic. And I write about the erotic because I'm very into interesting things, right? Nobody wants to sit around and read in the library about like dust jackets. So like, yeah, let's keep it sexy, right? Let's read about the erotic. But also, I noticed that Black people were constantly being maligned by making them hypersexual. In other words, there's sort of this imposition of hypersexuality that is constantly being placed on Black people to suggest that they are out of control, to suggest that they need to be dominated to keep others safe, right? That they're criminal, that they lack control over their passions, right? And all of this is very much out of a Christian discourse of sexuality. And so I began to play with the concept of the erotic to figure out, well, as we look at the erotic and we look at the experience of the erotic, right? These sort of ecstatic movements, the sense of joyousness, this fulfillment, that it sounds a lot like that time the Spirit visited me, right? And I couldn't stop rocking back and forth. I couldn't stop talking, and I was filled with all of these good feelings, and I didn't want it to end. And so what are the connections between the erotic and the Holy Spirit? If we consider the erotic the manifestation of love, how might we be able to harness it for the sake of breaking down some of these racialized barriers, some of these class barriers, some of these gender barriers? And so that's what my work is. It's been a long, long way coming, and it's still not done. I think I'm really very much at the beginning of my career. But for me, exploring the manifestation of love, exploring what it means to put our bodies in different spaces and to learn from one another and to gain new perspectives is a holy work. And for me, it's a holy work, not only because it gets us more in touch with ourselves and our understandings of our own bodies, our own identities, and our own spiritualities, but it also gives us a number of tools so that we can begin to surmount this obstacle that is racism, that is heterosexism. Because as the experience that I had with Christina taught me, these categories, they're not real. Just like race as a construct is not real. And even gender is not real, right? But that we allow these kinds of ideas to dictate who and what we do, who we hang out with, what's appropriate, what's not, who is worthy of protection, who is not, who is a criminal, and who is not. But through womanism, as I began to debunk a number of these myths, what continued to come up was this notion that when you put people together in a place and allow them to live life and to literally, quote unquote, be together, right? To share in food, to share in fellowship, to share in one another's dreams and one another's pain, that it fosters a kind of mutuality that only the erotic can. And that in so doing, we begin to move away from a relational dynamic built on domination. And instead, we move towards a relationship built out of love. This takes time, though. This takes work. But mostly what it takes is for us to begin to make ourselves uncomfortable by putting ourselves in places that don't always feel so powerful, in places that don't always feel so comfortable, but that in the midst, that the experience itself teaches us so much, as I said, about who we really are and what's really important to us, but also about all of the ways that those people that we thought were different actually just aren't, and what our responsibility is to them and them to us when we think about it within a Christian framework or a spiritual framework for those of you who are not Christian, because I think that it translates nonetheless, right? This power, this force of love that resides within us, right? Oftentimes I describe human beings as embodied spirits, right? But these embodied spirits have within them the ability to shift and transform the world. And we have that ability through our actions, through the love that we show, through our willingness to allow ourselves to be uncomfortable. Has anybody ever been in a situation across difference, any kind of difference, where they learned something about themselves? No, that wasn't rhetorical. That was really a question. Feeling a little nervous? That's okay. That's okay. But it's 8:14, so I'm finished talking for now, and I'm opening it up for questions. But my first question is to the audience. Has anyone ever been in a situation where they found themselves growing, where they discovered something new about themselves or others by making themselves uncomfortable and putting themselves in a space where they could be with others who are not like them?
I guess that's my first question. I mean, like, I'm asking it back.
Okay.
How do I get in that mindset of going beyond race and gender? I mean, even attending class at NC, I'm sometimes the only Black female woman in the class, and I don't know how to go beyond that, you know?
Right. Well, I will say this, Ashley. First, I don't think that needs to be your first, that doesn't need to be your first agenda item. Your first agenda item needs to be getting comfortable with who you are so that when you are in those spaces, you can show up in a way that is confident, that is assured, and that doesn't do damage to you, right? Because I think a lot of times, particularly as people of oppressed groups, that we feel like it is our responsibility to go and bridge the gap. And I don't know that it's always the case. And I think especially in this climate, right, our country's in such a crazy place. Your first line of defense is to make sure that you are safe, to make sure that you are good, right? But I do think that in order for us to begin to think about life beyond the constraints of race, class, and gender, that we have to consider the subaltern. And that is an academese word, which simply means creating a space that does not operate under the rules or guidelines of our current reality, right? And one that also offers greater possibilities. And so I often get picked on, right? Because I am the Black minister who's always trying to get white people and Black people together to figure out their racial stuff. And my Black friends are always like, why? Like, stop. And so the first thing is you have to like not worry about what your friends say, because you have to remember that we all unfortunately marinate in the same juices, right? That's my very simple way of saying that. All of the ideas that go on in the social imagination, the things that we agree upon, right? The stereotypes, the assumptions, you have to put those aside, and like you have to commit to that. In the Bible, I'm reminded of a time when Jesus comes upon a gentleman, and his disciples have been trying to cast a demon out, right? They've seen Jesus do it, and now they're trying to cast this demon out. In the name of Jesus, come out, come out. And this demon will not relent. The demon is like, listen, no, I'm here, sorry. And so the disciples are like, why couldn't we get the demon to come out? What's the problem? And Jesus says, does anybody remember what Jesus says? No, it's okay. It's all right. Jesus says, this kind of demon only comes out with prayer and fasting, right? They had seen him over and over again cast out demons. And now here they were, and they were trying to get this demon to come out, and he would not come out. And Jesus says, this kind of demon only comes out with prayer and fasting. I think racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, all of these are demons in my mind. They are demons that will not come out without prayer and fasting, which means, how do you do that? Well, number one, yeah, you need to talk to God about it. Like, God, like, what do we really, and this is how I talk to God. I've come to this point. I used to be really like, oh, Jesus, thou art so wonderful, right? That used to be me. But now in my older age, I'm like, God, you know what's up. And, so, I don't want to continue to live according to these sorts of racialized dynamics of domination. I don't want to live according to heterosexism and sexism. I don't want to live according to toxic masculinity. And trust, women can also live according to toxic masculinity, unfortunately. And so you have to make that initial personal commitment not to do it, right? So that's the prayer. But then there's the fasting. Who knows what fasting is? Anybody know? Dr. Lee, I know you know.
Yes, but I'm not going to jump in.
So fasting is when someone goes without, right? It's an ascetic practice. You can either go without food. Sometimes you can fast television. You can fast whatever you want, and you do it for a spiritual purpose, right? Typically to get closer to God. Right? But in this sense, Jesus is saying prayer and fasting will get a demon out. Well, what I say is fast from racism, fast from sexism, fast from news, right? Fast from classism. And you know the ways that classism, white supremacy, and heterosexism exist within you, right? You have to conquer it within yourself first. But fasting from it means stop participating in it. Pray to God about it, and then stop participating in it. Now, how many of you guys know how difficult it is to fast? It's incredibly hard. In fact, when people start talking about, oh yeah, come on, we're going to fast for this or that, I'm like, you're going to catch me on the other side. I don't know. I'll send up a prayer, but I'm not really trying to fast. Anyway, fasting is difficult, right? And you have to keep your head in the game, right? When you're fasting food and you've been fasting all morning, and then it's like 7 p.m. and you've said that you're going to fast for a full day, and then you see somebody walking by with a cupcake. What are we doing? Right? It's the same way, though. If you pray to God and you say, you know what, I want to operate differently in the world. I want to operate as though these are my brothers and sisters, because we are all created and have the image of God within us, right? And then you come along, you say, I'm going to fast from racism. I'm not going to engage in it anymore. I'm not going to engage in classism. But here comes your friend with that cupcake, right? Or here comes your friend with that racial slur. Or here comes your friend with that off-color remark about women. Or here comes your friend with a joke about the transgender community, right? And so it's in this moment that you got to focus in. You have to continue to be prayerful, and you have to continue to fast, right? But I say all that to say that it's hard because there are so many influences that are operating or working against you when you attempt to fast and pray beyond Is it all about discipline? It's always about discipline. But as a Christian, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you it's about discipline, but it's also about collaborating with the Spirit, right? God doesn't expect you to be able to do anything alone at all. And so if you're constantly asking, if you're constantly seeking to be better, and you're constantly inviting God into that work with you, it becomes a little easier. Don't get me wrong, it's always hard, but it's not something you have to do by yourself. Any other questions?
Two on very different planes. So
Okay.
I'll read both, but you can pick which way you sort of want to go.
Okay.
The first is, I'm curious on where you see the line of, like, where do you draw the line of working across difference? Is it like when you think it's never going to happen? Is it when it's getting to a point where you don't feel safe having those conversations? Is it when it becomes a bigger thing across, like, friend circles for one, or is there another option? And then my second question on a whole other plane, which is, I'm curious what you've been reading or listening to since quarantine.
Oh, wow. This stack of books on my, okay. So let's deal with the first one. How do you know when, like, how do you know the boundaries? What are the limits? And I would say that the limits are that at any point that you feel exploited, at any point that you feel uncomfortable, or at any point that you feel like the interaction is not productive, it is perfectly within your right to stop. I will tell you that, yes, love, justice, equity, and community mean a lot to me. But if you ask any of my friends, I don't have a lot of patience for foolishness. You understand what I'm saying? There are a number of efforts, whether they be on MC's campus, whether they be in the community, whether they be in the church, that I did not find fruitful, that I did not feel a sense of calling to, right? And so you know what I said? No, period. There's nothing wrong with that. And it's, it's tough, particularly as women and particularly as those who are oppressed, because we are constantly made to believe that we need to be in service to other folks, whether it be in service to men, in service to white folks, you name it, right? And so it is hard to draw that line because we believe that kind of self-sacrifice is spiritual, right? Ashley mentioned this notion of discipline, and discipline is important. But you can't be that cup that is always pouring into someone when there is no reciprocity and nothing is being poured into you, right? And that's one of the things that Generation X and Z have gotten really well. Like, I've learned so much from this generation on how to be like, no, hard stop. There's nothing holy about letting people trample upon you. So that was the first question. Can you remind me of the second question, please?
What are you reading and or listening to?
Okay. So I am listening to the new Busta Rhymes. No, but that's real. I am. I am currently reading Creating Ourselves, African Americans and Hispanic Americans on popular culture and religious expression. I know you want that, Dr. Lee. I am always reading In Flesh and Freedom. Oh, here's a great book. Who wrote that? That is an edited volume, Dr. Lee, by Anthony Pinn and Benjamin Balitin. Yeah, Balitin. I am also reading Jezebel Unhinged by Tamora Lomax. Really, really good. She's actually a personal friend. I am reading a lot of Alice Walker because I use a lot of Alice Walker's fiction in my work. I am reading Dancing with God by Karen Baker Fletcher, and I'm reading that devotionally, actually. I'm reading Race, Gender, and Class? Women, Class, and Race by Angela Davis, right? I'm reading that. So you see, scholars read 72 books at a time. And I am in and out of Isabella Wilkerson's Cast. Thank you, Cast. And that's enough, right? That's enough. But a scholar's work is never done. I'm telling you, I wake up every morning like I need to read, and every night I always go to bed feeling like I have not read enough. Getting a PhD makes you a workaholic. I never was before. I was so normal and chill, and I could watch a TV show and not worry. And now I'm always thinking about work. But I love the work as well. So I want to close with this, if there aren't any more questions. I am so thrilled every morning to wake up, right? And I'm so thrilled every morning to wake up and do what I do because I get to teach young people about the fallacy of race, class, and gender. I love that. I love preaching and teaching and giving the Black men in the Baptist church the business about the ways in which they oppress Black women in the church. I love that. I love being a covert operative, right? I love being the person that you think is going to be all smiley and wonderful, but in actuality, I'm an agitator, right? But I'm an agitator for the spirit. I'm an agitator who is constantly seeking justice and am so in love with community. So anytime I get the opportunity to create greater community, anytime I get the opportunity to help students understand their place in the world and begin to untangle and debunk some of the ideologies that so constrict our identities and the ways that that we are able to relate to one another, this sort of thing gets me going. And so between teaching and writing and reading and preaching towards a more just world and towards a more loving world makes me know every day that the path that God sent me down was the right path. And I'm just so thankful that God gave me the courage and the boldness to say no when it wasn't the right path and to say yes and step into the discomfort of becoming.